Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. Ukraine War Frontline update for the 31st of August 2023. Slightly different setup today. There was a serious lag on my other laptop for the mapping segment of my news update this morning, and I've been long trying to get this other laptop I have that's more powerful, but the sound card doesn't seem to be quite as, I don't know, the sound isn't as great on it. So I've got myself a new mic. A standalone mic that's sitting there, but it does have the ability to pick up bangs on the table. Like if I move my mouse, that picks up. So I need to be really careful. I have a boom on the way from good old eBay there, and hopefully that will mitigate some of those sounds. But let me know what you think of the sound. Is the sound okay? And I do apologize if it does pick up some of the background stuff. I love using a headset. Some people are not fans of headsets. This particular headset with the mic adjusted is actually a really good sounding headset, but it just doesn't go well with the laptop. Oh goodness me, tech, eh? Anyway, that's enough nonsense. Let's get on with the front line, and not too much extra to be said from that segment this morning, except hopefully you got maps that move quite smoothly. In fact, I've got two maps open on this, which I wouldn't be able to do on my other laptop without it kicking off and splitting in my face. So here we go. We'll start in the northeast sector and we'll move down in the normal fashion. We have this area near Kupiansk, the Kupiansk to, so smooth on a more powerful computer, Kupiansk to Svatova to Kremina there, and Andriivka Perpetua, the blue line. Goodness me, I haven't done my map legend yet. There it is. Pause if you want to know what my map means. So anyway, going back to the map, the blue line of Andriivka Perpetua, the pro-Ukrainian mapper, shows here that the Russians have been pushed back in this area, in the Liman-Pershi area, where Syriac Maps, a pro-Russian mapper, says that they have made consistent advances. There have been claims that the Russian narrative here has been somewhat over-egged and that the Russians aren't as far forward as is claimed. Sinkivka isn't, I guess, arguably not under as much threat, not as vulnerable as some may have thought. The claim here is that there's a TOS-1 thermobaric barrage against some Ukrainian positions here in this tree line, and that has meant to Andriivka Perpetua that the Ukrainians are there, and that would mean that the Russians are further back. And so he's pushed the Russians back. I mean, this is with the importance of tracking who is shelling where, and it tells you, where the targets are, and who the targets are. If that's a thermobaric munition, that's going to be used by the Russians against Ukrainian positions, and that is a claim there. So Russians are not as far forward there as had been thought. I don't know whether that means that the Ukrainians have pushed them back, whether that's a gain for the Ukrainians, or as I've kind of, or JR, thanks for doing the mapping, JR has shown here, or whether they had never got that far. And what Syriac Maps was saying was just not true. I don't know. I can't speak to that. Right, we're going to come down to Novoselivska, where there is some gain. Not to Novoselivska. Sorry, I mentioned earlier today in my news segment, that actually the Russians, and it's not on my map yet, but Andriivka Perpetua added a bit later, that the Russians have made some gains across the railway line that comes down here, separates Novoselivska, this small settlement, from Vremivka. The Russians have made some gains across the railway line just north of Novoselivska, so the Russians are now over here. In fact, if we go to his map, that we should be able to see that. I can now have two maps open. Woo! Right, we can see that there is a little bit of a gain for the Russians there, and there's a drone attack by Ukrainians to signify that is indeed the case. So that is it's interesting for up there. And then we come down to this Karmazionivka area, where we have some, and I think you can see that the Russians had made some quite serious gains from the original counteroffensive line back here. That made it to sort of 6 kilometers, I think, to the west of there. And actually, the Ukrainians have pushed them back consistently since then, and that they've pushed them back a further amount near Novoherivka. So if we zoom in a little bit more, you've got Novoherivka there. The Ukrainians pushing them just to the east and to the north. They're pushing the Russians back. So some success for the Ukrainians there too. In fact, when you look up and down the front line, the Ukrainians seem to be having more success than the Russians in certain areas. It swings and roundabouts. Other than that, there will be repelled attacks from the Russians and Ukrainians along this northeastern sector axis. We come now to the Serebyansky forest, where the Russians have had more success than the Ukrainians over the past couple of months. They've been pushing the Ukrainians back a little bit, but however, Andriy Perpetua said he doesn't change lines in a forest as easily does elsewhere, because shelling is quite difficult to ascertain given the coverage that the canopy gives. But he says it's definitely the case that the Russians have been pushed back in this area of the Serebyansky forest. I don't know if we have him talking about that on his latest thread. No, we don't. I don't think so. Anyway, that's according to his map update from yesterday. Right, now let's pull out of there and move down to Bakhmut. We have Syriac maps admitting that in the southern area of Bakhmut, the Ukrainian army has recaptured some positions close to the water channel south of Vremivka. So that's right down here. I guess we'll go there first and work our way up. So right down to the south, we have both deep state maps and Syriac maps here, admitting that the Ukrainians have pushed the Russians back. And that is significant because it is pushing the Russians back to the east across the canal. So the canal has acted as a natural barrier, and up until the Ukrainians started pushing back, it was a natural barrier right the way up here, or I guess an unnatural barrier, it's man-made, but it is acted as a really good barrier that kept the Ukrainians from easily sort of counter-attacking places. But then once they did get over it to the north, they were able to clear up by going sort of down the canal and clearing all this area here, as well as heading eastwards to Klishchivka and then Andriivka. But around Kurdyivka, the Russians have still got control of the eastern side of the canal. And so therefore, I think it's important that the Ukrainians have managed to get some purchase the other side of the canal right to the south, and they can then push up towards Vremivka and towards Kurdyivka from the south. So that could be significant, because around Kurdyivka, the Russians have still been able to hold out, and Vremivka for some time now. Now, as we move up to really Andriivka and Klishchivka, there's quite a lot to be said here. The first thing to say is that the Ukrainians have made some seriously important gains, I think. I mean, they don't look very big at all, but they've got across the embankment, the raised embankment, which has dugouts all along them and tree lines both to the east and west, or both sides of the railway track. This is a very good barrier for a good defensive line for the Russians, and the Ukrainians have been unable to break through. And I think this acts just as the trenches do in Zaporizhzhia, as I said earlier today, that as soon as the Ukrainians are able to break through this inner place, then it renders the defensive, I suppose, characteristics of that embankment kind of impotent. You know, you break through in one place and then suddenly it's like the dam is broken. You can get them behind the enemy, and you can move. If they're trenches, you can roll up and down them, or you can come in behind them, so on and so forth. So the defense, these kind of defenses are only as good as the ability not to be broken. Like I can't get the words, but as soon as they're broken, they kind of all fold, and then you move on to the next line of defenses. Where here, that might well be the road coming north to south here from Opitny down to Avdiivka. Whether the Ukrainians can take advantage of this, whether they have enough resources in the area, I don't know. Whether the Russians are going to really try and push back. I said the other day that Andriivka was really vulnerable to being liberated now by the Ukrainians, and although the Ukrainians hadn't actually gone into Andriivka, despite what had been said a couple of weeks back, it appears that actually, according to Andriy Perpetua, Andriy Perpivka, oh my God, what's going on? Words and Ukrainian. It seems like this is now a contested grey zone, and I would expect the Ukrainians to have control of Andriivka at some point fairly soon. But even small villages like this can take a long time to get through. I mean, goodness me, each side seems to fight over a hedgerow, a tree line for sometimes a week or two, and it can change hands a number of times. So even somewhere small as Andriivka can be fiercely fought over. Syriac maps then saying that actually the Ukrainians have pushed the Russians back to the south of Klishchiivka. They finally admitted that it's not under Russian control, and sort of generally aligning with these deep state maps, yellow line there. So there is that. But interestingly, Andriivka here showing that this area of land, and we'll go and find out on his map and see what he has to say about that. That area of land to the north of Klishchiivka, is under Russian control. So he says, there's a Ukrainian drone attack, and that signifies that the Russians control that. He'll be looking at shelling and whatnot. Now, this is, if you remember, this is the area where the Ukrainians have hammered some Russian, I think at least once, some Russian vehicles doing attacks along there, because this is a high ground here. So if you look on my map, that's 170 meters there. And if you come down into Klishchiivka, that's 155. So you got sort of a 15 to 20 meter, that's 200 meters there. You got 25. So about 25 meter difference between these two. And then up here, it's 184. So you basically, it's easier to attack this higher ground up here from the north along the higher ground itself, coming along the ridge, rather than trying to fight up the incline. I'll see if I can get it on my 3D. I can't accentuate on the browser-based version of this the height difference like Andriivka can, but you can see that that's uphill. And rather than attacking uphill here, oh dear. I knew it would go wrong. Rather than attacking uphill here, you might as well attack along the ridge. So we'll try and do that again, shall we? Okay, there we go. So moving in. Yeah, so this is the uphill. And then it appears that the Russians have been really trying to attack along the ridge towards the top over there, rather than coming from Klishchiivka. Right, let's try, before I make a complete fool of myself, I will come back to my bird's eye view. So we saw them lose a lot of equipment there, but it appears that they have some kind of control over this. I don't know whether this is something they've kind of always had, or whether this is new and whether they've attacked here. So it could well be Russian gains, because even if they lost equipment here, it doesn't mean that just because they're there, they control it. They're just driving through there to attack the Ukrainians in this trench line area that we can see here. These are trench lines from 2018. This imagery that you're looking at now is 2018 imagery. So it's been there for some time. There'll be more extensive trench works built since then. But that's what the Russians are trying to attack, and they've lost some equipment, but seem to have gained more land there. Okay, as we come to the north, there's this area to the north of Bakhmut along the E40 highway, the M03. The Ukrainians have gained some of that forest area, which is important for them to be able to kind of move down this road, maybe cut off the Russians in the Zaporizhzhia area. The Russian front line or defensive line in this northern area kind of follows the river. So it's a bit like that embankment down south. You need to be able to break through that to then come at it from behind. And actually, one of the best ways is probably coming down this road and then being able to attack from this direction, rather than trying to get across the river with mechanized equipment and whatnot, which is probably not gonna happen. So I think this is an important, albeit small, gain. The question is, again, how many resources do the Ukrainians have for counterattacks around here? Have they taken the advice of the Americans, for example, and moved some of their resources from the Bakhmut area to the Zaporizhzhia front line? I know people like Sursky are saying that actually we shouldn't move too much stuff from the northeastern sector, for example, to the Zaporizhzhia front line in the south, because we're worried about the Russians in the north. Well, what are the Ukrainians doing in Bakhmut? There are a lot of Russian resources in this area, but they are not in a great way, because actually they're pinned down by artillery in Bakhmut, and they've not had too much success in defending over the last couple of months, as in the Ukrainians have been putting them under a lot of pressure, but yeah, I don't know. I don't know what the Ukrainian strategy is going to be for Bakhmut going forward. Right, okay. We'll go to the ISW Institute for the Study of War that says about Bakhmut, a Kremlin-affiliated mill blogger claimed that Russian forces successfully attacked near Avdiivka. This goes against what the evidence is pointing towards in terms of what the mappers are saying. This is to say that the Russians are having some success around Avdiivka, but that's as according to Russian mill bloggers. That's allowed supposedly Russian forces to expand their area of control of the settlement and push Ukrainian forces to the Sversky Donetsk canal rather than, in this kind of area being pushed away from the canal. I mean, that is further to the south, admittedly, but yeah, I don't know whether we can take seriously Russian successes in the Avdiivka area. Another Kremlin affiliated mill blogger claimed that Russian forces regained some positions near Klishchivka. Again, that doesn't seem to be backed up by any of the mappers. The Ukrainian General Staff, however, reported that Russian forces carried out unsuccessful offensive operations in Avdiivka, Zaporizhzhia, and Bohdonivka. So the Ukrainians denying that that's actually happened. Right, let's pull out of there, come further to the south, and we'll go to the Avdiivka area, where there appears to be, well, first of all, just looking around Avdiivka itself, there's some rejigs of Syriac maps to show that actually the Russians control a bit more around there than had previously been thought, but I don't think that signifies any gains over the last 24 hours or attacks by the Russians. Now, here to the north of Avdiivka, at a place called Krasnohorivka, be warned, there's a Krasnohorivka to the north, and as we know, a Krasnohorivka to the south of Avdiivka. That's how they rock, and how indeed they roll. This is, some gains for the Ukrainians around here being omitted by Syriac maps and deep state maps. We had this from Andriivka previously, so now they all kind of agree that the Russians are being put under some pressure, being pushed to the east of the railway line that curls around here and goes north from Krasnohorivka. Andriivka in his live stream the other night was saying that he thinks the Russians are a little bit weaker in this area. Bakhmutivka could be vulnerable. The Ukrainians want this road coming north to south here not because they'd use it as a ground line of communication or anything, because hey, there's a road going nowhere, but because it has trench lines affiliated with it and it's quite a useful defensive line. So the Ukrainians will be pushing themselves towards that across the railway line and hoping that might act as a line for them, but they would obviously want to carry on pushing and take back some of these settlements they lost, as these are allowing the Russians to have a greater threat of encircling Avdiivka. Okay, so Syriac maps here admitting this. So the situation north of Avdiivka, Ukrainian army recaptured some positions at the railway. Okay, right, now let's move on. We're going to pop into Rebar here. So what does Rebar have to say about where we're going next? Indeed, where are we going next? Well, before you go there, some more Avdiivka claims, sorry. South of Avdiivka, we have a small settlement called Nevelska, an agricultural settlement. This whole area around here is rife with tree lines being dug in, with trenches, and with small sort of fortifications. So I think this one here, is that the one that used to be called the reservoir? Or the swimming pool or something like that. So that is a kind of fortification with, even from 2018, you can see it's got trench lines there. There'll be far more. Now, every single one of these tree lines is covered in dugouts and whatnot. All of these kind of fortifications are really difficult to take. And they have allowed, and Nevelska has allowed Ukraine to withstand Russian pressure to come and try and flank Pervomaisky, which itself is withstanding pressure from being overwhelmed, to then stop the Russians from encircling Avdiivka. And then you have small places like Severny also being really important for stopping that happening. So all of these tiny little settlements are really important, but they are surprisingly difficult to take. All of this land, you just can't roll over it unless you just have a massive, overwhelming force of troops and mechanized equipment and close air support. If you don't have that, we've seen the Russians attack in dribs and drabs. We've seen them send, around here near Pervomaisky, to the south of Pervomaisky, send up in this area where you see some pins. And around here over the last couple of months, we've seen them, send 5, 6, 7, 10 pieces of equipment at once, and even then they get hammered because all of this is marked by, drones and Ukrainian artillery, and they're kind of pinpoint accurate when they need to be. And just unless you've really overwhelming forces, because some of these attacks become fairly suicidal. Anyway, so some gains for the Ukrainians there to give them an extra buffer zone around Novelsky and a bit of breathing space. So very, very useful. Some claims about Marinka, actually, before I do go to Rebar again. Here we have Andrew Perpetua. He doesn't really know what to make of this, but the claim is from a video that shows some explosions in the distance, and the label on the video is that it is a Russian airstrike on a Ukrainian ammo cache, and it comes from, I therefore presume, a Russian source. Now, where this is positioned, as far as his map is concerned, is to the south of Marinka, somewhere about there. So let's go and look at that on my map. So this is somewhere around here. And he says that basically, if that is the Ukrainians hitting Russians hitting a Ukrainian ammo dump, then the Ukrainians really are a lot further forward than you've given them credit for, and it's certainly a lot further forward than Syriac maps is admitting. So he doesn't quite know what to make of it. It's either incorrectly labelled, and that's a Ukrainian attack on a Russian ammo dump, or the Ukrainians have made some inroads, at least 1.7 kilometers worth of advances in that area. Don't really know, to be honest, but it's something worthy of note, I guess. He says, speaking of Marinka, I decided to limit the grey area in the city. This video today of a Russian ATGM hitting a Ukrainian position marks the front line. There have been numerous videos of Russian shelling, droning and assaulting Ukrainian positions here dating back months. And so basically from his map, that's not a great image of his map. So according to his map, I'll go back to mine. Everything's going wrong. So according to Perpetua's map, he has this grey zone now much further closer towards the Russian lines, which is to say that Ukrainians actually control much more of Marinka than he had previously thought. So it's not necessarily the case that the Ukrainians have advanced, but now there's drone footage to suggest that the Ukrainians actually control the vast amount of the grey zone in what is left of Marinka there. So that is worthy of note, I guess, for that area. Right now, let's go to the rest of the front, which is bypassing Novomykhailivka, coming down past Mikilska to Pavlivka area. As I promised, let's pop into Rebar, who says, as we go on to Staromylska in the Vremivka sector, which is a Velika Novosilka area, the Ukrainians were forced to reduce their offensive activity due to the losses. So I was talking about them having to refit, take an operational pause, and it could well be they had to do that because they were taking substantial losses. So that's not necessarily untrue there. But it goes on to say, taking advantage of the enemy's lack of initiative, Russian forces expanded their zone of control west of Staromylska, which is interesting. Not heard that anywhere else. This is to say that it can only be in this area, where I've heard that they pulled out yesterday. Many sources saying that this area is now a flat sort of front line and the Russians have pulled out of there. And yet Rebar is now saying that the Russians have made some gains to the west. I don't know what to make of that. It's probably untrue. If we come to what the ISW have to say, the Kremlin-affiliated mill blogger claimed that Russian forces advanced in the direction of Volodymyr, and that Russian forces had to retreat from several heights in the area due to the threat of tactical encirclement. So that is what I'm saying, which is it goes against what Rebar is saying. So Rebar is saying some gains to the west of Staromylsky, and other sources saying no, they pushed the Russians back towards Volodymyr there. Make it out what you will. Other Russian mill bloggers and the Russian Vostok Battalion commander Khodakovsky claim that Ukrainian forces are increasing offensive activity on the Priyutne-Staromylsky line. Again, I would go with what Khodakovsky is saying here rather than Rebar. It would be my personal conclusion. These gains there, according to Andrew Perpetua, just a little tree line really. Just a rejig for him. That was possibly a game from the 22nd, so kind of almost 10 days ago now. So not something that's happened in the last 24 hours. Right, we'll move now to the west from the Velika Novosilka salient. It has been relatively quiet other than that Priyutna area, although, that happened yesterday. So I don't know. Be one to keep an eye on, of course. I was saying yesterday that I think they could be gearing up to continue their offensive more, in a bigger way here. That refit might be over, but I don't know. We shall see. Right, coming down to Robotine, as ever, it's all about. I say as ever, as of the last sort of 2 weeks, it seems to be all about Robotine. Let's go to Rebar first. In the Orikhiv sector, the Ukrainians were able to slightly advance northwest of Verbove. So this is the admission that the Ukrainians have advanced around this area, coming down into Verbove. And then then Rebar finishes with, nevertheless, statements by Western journalists about the breach of the Russian forces' first line of defense do not correspond to reality. In other words, denies that the Ukrainians have made the gains that pretty much everyone is saying. ISW says Russian mill blogger claimed the Russian forces. Oh no, I've gone past this now. But there's some claims that around Mikilska, this is in a weird order for the ISW. Khodorkovsky has also claimed that the Marines have recaptured several positions around Mikilska, which is near Avdiivka. So just to throw that in, there's nothing to show on a map, but perhaps some regains for the Russians around there. At least that's according to the leader of the Vostok battalion. So we saw yesterday there was engagement of the Ukrainians around Shevchenko and possibly in this area to the south of Avdiivka. The Russians have been pushed back towards the river here at Mikilska over the last sort of month or so. It could be that they've regained some ground there, but there's no other sources I've seen talk about that outside of what the ISW is mentioning there. Right now, as we come down to Verbove, geolocated footage published yesterday shows that Ukrainian infantry have advanced to the northwest outskirts of Verbove. Okay, but the extent of those advances and current control of these positions are currently unclear. In other words, you don't know how long a side holds on to a particular area of ground that they capture and whether they're pushed back immediately. Now, if you take a snapshot when they pushed as far as possible, then you say, the Ukrainians are here, they control all of this ground. Could be that an hour later they've been pushed back a kilometre or whatnot. So, ISW is right to kind of question how robustly each side controls an area. Ukrainian forces' ability to advance so close to Verbove, it indicates degraded Russian control around the settlement. However, the Ukrainian General Staff reported that Ukrainian forces were successful in two areas. So they've been basically successful in this direction and that direction, as far as I can work out, is what they mean by those two areas. Russian sources claim that Ukrainian forces attacked the outskirts of Verbove overnight, 29th to the 30th, and on the morning of the 30th, but that Russian forces repelled those attacks. And one Russian mill blogger characterized the Russian situation in Verbove as very difficult. I reported that yesterday. And that Ukrainian forces conducted armoured attacks near Robotine. Okay, what do the other sources say? So, Poulet Volant shows that the Ukrainians have managed to push the Russians back past and gain control of land to the east of the tank ditch and on the way to the manned trench line. So that's now all grey zone with the Russians controlling basically along the trench line into the north of Verbove. What's important about Verbove, though, and I show you on Andrew Perpetua's map here, because you can bring up the... so if we bring up his fortification, not the fortification lines there, if you can get into this area and come down these kind of trench lines here and then move into the northwestern outskirts, which apparently they have done, and they might even control an awful lot more of Verbove than that, then you can come around and behind the trench lines, and then it kind of renders all of this trench line kind of moot, and you would expect the Russians to pull out there. So that's what I would expect to happen. Let's go back to some of the sources. Syriac Map says that the situation at Zaporizhzhia front during the last few hours, the Russian army has continued retreating towards the main defense line as the Ukrainian army not only increased the probing attacks, but also managed to set a foothold behind the line, which means the line suffered the first breach. Of course, there may be a difference between a tank ditch and Dragon's Teeth, and then this manned trench line. And so, yes, you can breach that, but possibly it's not as important as breaching the next line. There are some claims that they haven't yet got mechanized equipment over the ditches yet. So this is just infantry that are doing the fighting here. I can't confirm or deny that. Ukrainian forces have visually confirmed that they've broken through the primary Russian defense line west of Verbove, says Tendai. In addition, another Ukrainian deep strike force operates east of Novoprokopivka. So they're moving down towards Verbove, moving south towards, or at least parallel with Novoprokopivka, so they can attack that from the east. Here we have the armed forces of Ukraine were able to break through the Surovikin line, and battles are already underway on the outskirts of Verbove. That is, a dragon's teeth restrained the Ukrainian soldiers for only about a day. That's according to the Bild German mainstream media source footage. That's out of order. After the breakthrough of the defense lines of the Russian forces, day after day, messages from the Russians began, which cannot help but warm the soul, says Getty. Footage has appeared. It claimed strikes on the positions of the. It is claimed that strikes on the positions of the Ukrainians in the southeastern part of the Verbove village are taking place. So, if there are strikes taking place on Ukrainians in that position, then so according to the fighters, Ukrainians entered the village and are fighting for on the western outskirts. It is claimed that strikes on the positions of the Ukrainians. Yes, so that is indeed claims that the Ukrainians are in this part of the village and that Russians are striking them there. And of course, if that is the case, then that is highly significant and shows that the Russians really have been almost pushed out of Verbove. But, take that with a pinch of salt. There are only two options here. Either the Russians are lying or the armed forces of Ukraine control almost all of the settlements. And then to kind of back that up, yes, there's video footage here of I think grads being used and Ka-52 attack helicopters flying, which is significant. So they're bringing their attack helicopters obviously to bear here in trying to defend Verbove. But some of those clouds indicate from geolocations that those grads, which are supposedly fired by the Russians, are hitting places again to the southeast of Verbove. And if that's the case, then the Ukrainians are there, in which case they're pretty much controlling the whole of the settlement. Of course, there's a small but existing possibility that the original poster could have mistaken Russian shelling with the Ukrainian one. So that might be the case. It could be that the Ukrainians are using grads to hit the Russian positions there. One or the other is true, of course. Now, a bit of analysis on who's fighting where and what we can derive from that. David D says 1,429th Mobilised Regiment is so screwed. Ukraine looks to be moving forward, according to reports. So this is one of the regiments that's defending the trench lines, or was between the tank ditches and the man trench lines, and they're under a lot of pressure, according to David D. Well, this then has led Lawrence Duff here to say if the Russians army doesn't move to reinforce the 1,429th and their three bars, which are reserves elements, then the Ukrainian 82nd and 46th brigades could tear a hole and there's nothing behind. The Russian rear command unit, logistics, artillery, air defense are screwed, and Tokmak and the area become possible. The Russian second and third lines have no one in them, and this is exactly what I've been saying for some time, which is once you get behind these lines, these initial first lines here, if you are treating the Russians as well, whilst doing this, taking prisoners, eliminating soldiers and equipment, do they have anyone here at all, or are they completely depending on retreating troops to man these trenches? And if they are, then momentum is key, and you can just end up breaking through quite quickly and being pretty successful, because there's just no one left at home here. There's just no one behind these initial lines to pull from. So, and that's kind of what a lot of pro-Ukrainians are saying. Now, the proof of the pudding's in the tasting, so we'll see whether that's true from a pro-Ukrainian point of view. Of course, I hope it is. So what we can say here is that, Syriac Maps and Andrew Perpetua are admitting that there are some significant gains for the Ukrainians in this Verbove area. It could be that Verbove is largely under the control of the Ukrainians or not. we shall see. But the Ukrainians are putting Novopokrovka and Verbove under a lot of pressure, and the first line of defences are in the process of being broken. The question is, going forward, what is to be made of these second and third lines of defence before you get to Ocheretuvate and then indeed Tokmak. And once you're there, as far as I'm concerned, here, if the Ukrainians can get here within 2 months, right, then that is success, because you are then able, like I've said before, if you can get to next to Tokmak here, you are then able to put the ground lines of communication under HIMARS control, and that will then stop you being able to supply, if you're Russian, stop you being able to basically supply this whole area, because the ground lines of communication from Crimea to Zaporizhzhia and Kherson are being hammered. Chonhar Bridge, Henichesk Bridge, and around Armyansk, we heard yesterday, Krasnoperekopsk there being hammered. I don't know what was taken out there, but you can rest assured that the logistics here are going to be hit. And then you put those two things together, and you have this whole area then just becomes really difficult for the Russians to supply. And if the Ukrainians can get themselves meaningfully across the river, then a bit of trouble for the Russians there. And in fact, let's go to that kind of neck of the woods at the moment. Atos 1A is targeting Ukrainian forces on the left bank of the Dnipro, west of Kozachi-Lahiri. The Russians made claims since yesterday that Ukrainians are trying to land more troops in this particular area after initial raids in the vicinity of Kozachi-Lahiri. The location for reference is here, so Kozachi-Lahiri. Now so on my map, that is just up here. We saw that the Ukrainians landed here and had this big, fairly decent bridgehead that they were then trying to expand to the south towards Podstepny and towards Kozachi-Lahiri. And then the Russians claimed that actually they had flushed the Ukrainians out of there. I am unsure as to where the Ukrainians are and whether they are there or not. But this is interesting because this would indicate that they are there, at least at the moment. Now, whether that is a subsequent further landing here after being pushed out and then landing again, I don't know. Or whether they have been there since they landed, and the Russians are still trying to sort of hammer them, in this case with thermobaric munitions. Anyway, there you go. Thank you very much for watching. Please like, subscribe and share. Let me know whether the map moved smoothly and whether the sounds were okay. It's probably picking up background sounds from the house, so apologies for that, but let me know. That'd be great. Anyway, in the meantime, take care. Speak soon.